All right, so today we're diving into the life of William Howard Taft. You know, the 27th president of the United States. You probably know him for his weight or that infamous bathtub story. But you're about to discover there's a lot more to Taft than those anecdotes. We're going beyond the surface to uncover the ambitions and complexities of this often overlooked figure and his surprising impact, especially when it comes to America's role on the world stage.
Yeah, what's interesting is that Taft had this reputation for being like a jovial figure, often overshadowed by the personality of his predecessor, Teddy Roosevelt. There's that famous quote from Roosevelt where he says he envied Taft's ability to just walk into a room and be liked. It kind of creates this image of someone who's affable and maybe a bit simple, but it's a deceptive image.
It really is. The sources paint a very different picture. They highlight Taft's impressive legal mind and early accomplishments. Born in 1857 to a politically connected family in Ohio, graduated from Yale Law School, became a judge all before he even hit 30. By the time he was 32, he was already serving as Solicitor General. Talk about a rising star.
Yeah, that rapid ascent is crucial. To understanding Taft's trajectory, he was clearly ambitious. But the sources suggest his true passion lay in the legal world. He repeatedly expressed a desire to serve on the Supreme Court, even turning down two opportunities to join the court while Roosevelt was president.
Which makes his next chapter even more intriguing. In 1901, President McKinley appointed Taft to lead a commission to the Philippines to establish a civil government. I mean, the U.S. had just acquired the Philippines after the Spanish-American War. There was intense debate about governing this new territory. Did Taft ever express any reservations about taking on that role?
He did. What's fascinating is that Taft initially had doubts about annexing the Philippines. He wasn't entirely convinced that expanding American control overseas was the right move. In fact, when offered the position, he said something to the effect of, "Like a bolt out of the blue, I never expected to be told I was going to be sent off to head a commission to the Philippines because I don't know anything about the Philippines." Imagine being tasked with setting up a government in a place you knew nothing about. But he ultimately felt a sense of duty and accepted the challenge.
And he didn't just go in blindly following orders. He had his own ideas about how to approach the situation. He wanted to differentiate himself from the previous governor, Arthur MacArthur, who relied heavily on military force. Instead, Taft instituted what became known as the policy of attraction.
This policy was strikingly different from the military approaches common at the time. It aimed to win over the Filipino population and foster a long-term partnership with the U.S., a partnership Taft envisioned as leading to eventual self-governance within a U.S. empire. He even modeled this relationship after the one between Canada and Great Britain.
So this was actually a pretty progressive vision for the early 20th century. But wouldn't you say there was a risk of appearing paternalistic? Was Taft genuinely advocating for true Filipino self-rule, or was this just a more subtle form of colonialism?
That's a great question, and one that historians continue to debate. But what's important is that Taft's time in the Philippines deeply shaped his thinking about America's role in the world. These experiences influenced his later foreign policy as president, what historians call dollar diplomacy.
Okay, so let's unpack dollar diplomacy because I think some listeners might need a refresher on what that actually means.
Essentially, it was an approach that prioritized economic influence, rather than military intervention in expanding U.S. power abroad. Taft believed that by investing in the economies of other nations, particularly in Latin America and Asia, the U.S. could create stability and promote its interests without resorting to force. Think of it as using financial leverage to achieve diplomatic goals.
But wasn't that policy criticized for being too focused on American economic interest? Was it really about helping other countries, or was it just a way to advance American power under the guise of economic development?
Well, that's the debate, isn't it? And there were definitely instances where Taft's dollar diplomacy efforts were seen as heavy-handed and self-serving. For example, he tried to establish free trade with Canada and push through arbitration treaties with Britain and France. But those efforts ultimately failed. Some saw these as attempts to strong-arm other countries into doing what the U.S. wanted, which caused resentment and diplomatic tension.
So it sounds like a mixed bag in terms of results, but it's clear that Taft's experiences in the Philippines, where he had to balance American interests with the needs and desires of the Filipino people, deeply influenced his approach to foreign policy. It makes you wonder, how did he end up in the White House in the first place?
Well, that's where Teddy Roosevelt comes back into the picture. You see, Roosevelt handpicked Taft to be his successor in the 1908 election. He saw Taft as someone who would continue his progressive policies and maintain his vision for America's expanding role in the world.
But didn't Roosevelt have some doubts about Taft's ability to fully fill his shoes? It almost seems like he was setting Taft up for failure. There's that quote where Roosevelt says, "Oh, Taft, yeah, he's great. He's going to be the great president. He's the next great thing."
Hmm.
It almost sounds like he knew Taft wouldn't quite live up to the hype.
That's an interesting observation. And it's true that beneath the surface of their seemingly cordial relationship, there were already hints of tension, a clash of personalities and governing styles waiting to erupt.
Which ultimately leads to that dramatic showdown in the 1912 election. But before we get there, I think it's important to delve a little deeper into the differences between Roosevelt and Taft and how those differences played out in their presidencies.
Because it's not just about their personalities, it's about fundamentally different visions of what the presidency should be and how America should engage with the world.
So we're talking about two very different personalities, two very different approaches to the presidency. Roosevelt was all about bold action, pushing the boundaries of executive power to achieve his goals. He was a master of using the media to shape public opinion and rally support for his agenda.
Exactly. Roosevelt truly believed in using the full force of the presidency to drive change. But Taft, with his legal background and more restrained temperament, had a very different view. He believed in following the rules, respecting the limits of presidential power, and adhering to a stricter interpretation of the Constitution.
It almost seems like their approaches to governing couldn't have been more different. And as we know, this fundamental clash played out in a number of key policy areas. Take, for example, the issue of conservation, something Roosevelt was incredibly passionate about.
Absolutely. Roosevelt was a true conservationist. He set aside millions of acres of land for national parks and forests, established the U.S. Forest Service, and really laid the groundwork for the modern conservation movement.
But Taft, while not necessarily opposed to conservation, was more cautious and concerned with the legal and economic ramifications of such sweeping actions. You mentioned earlier that Taft's legal mind was always at work. Can you elaborate on how that influenced his approach to these issues?
Sure. Taft was very meticulous and deliberate in his decision-making. He wanted to make sure that everything he did was legally sound and that he wasn't overstepping his authority as president. So while he agreed with the general principle of conservation, he was more inclined to work within existing legal frameworks and to consider the economic impact of setting aside large tracts of land.
Which is what led to that famous controversy involving Gifford Pinchot, Roosevelt's chief forester, and Richard Ballinger, Taft's Secretary of the Interior. It was a major turning point in Taft's presidency. For those who might not remember all the details, can you give us a quick recap of what happened?
Of course. Pinchot was a staunch conservationist and a close ally of Roosevelt. He accused Ballinger of corruption and of undermining Roosevelt's conservation legacy by opening up protected lands for development. Taft, however, sided with Ballinger and ultimately fired Pinchot.
Wow. So Taft fires the guy who was essentially the face of Roosevelt's conservation efforts. Talk about a bold move, but wouldn't you say that was a major miscalculation politically? I mean, it alienated conservationists, angered Roosevelt, and made Taft look like he was siding with big business over the environment.
It certainly didn't help Taft's popularity, and it really highlights that fundamental difference between him and Roosevelt. For Roosevelt, conservation was a moral imperative, a matter of national pride and heritage. But for Taft, it was more of a legal and economic issue. He was concerned with due process, property rights, and making sure that conservation efforts didn't hinder economic development.
It's fascinating to see how their different personalities and worldviews played out in such a concrete way. And this wasn't the only issue where they clashed. There was also the whole debate over tariff reform, something Taft campaigned on but ultimately struggled to achieve.
Right. Taft, as you mentioned earlier, had this deep-seated belief in following the rules and upholding the law. He saw tariff reform as a way to make the system fairer and more efficient. But he ended up angering both protectionists who wanted high tariffs and advocates for free trade who wanted low tariffs. It became a political quagmire. That damaged his reputation and further alienated him from Roosevelt and the progressive wing of the Republican Party.
It almost seems like everything that could go wrong did go wrong for Taft. He was constantly being compared unfavorably to Roosevelt, who had this larger-than-life persona and an uncanny ability to connect with the public.
And that's a key point. Roosevelt was a master of using the media to shape public perception. He knew how to appeal to people's emotions,
Yeah.
how to create a compelling narrative, and how to rally support for his causes. Taft, on the other hand, was much less adept at public relations. He was seen as stiff intellectual. and lacking the charisma that had made Roosevelt so popular.
So even if his policies were sound, he wasn't able to sell them to the American people in the same way that Roosevelt could. It makes you wonder, did Taft ever have a chance of escaping Roosevelt's shadow?
It was always going to be an uphill battle.
Yeah.
And as the rift between them grew wider, the stage was set for that dramatic showdown in the 1912 election.
Where Roosevelt decides to challenge Taft for the Republican nomination, ultimately leading to the formation of the progressive Bull Moose Party. It was a truly unprecedented moment in American political history. A former president running against his own hand-picked successor.
It really speaks to the depth of their animosity and the fundamental differences in their political philosophies. Roosevelt believed that Taft had betrayed his legacy and abandoned the progressive cause. He felt compelled to step back into the arena and fight for the principles he believed in.
And of course, the result was a split in the Republican Party, which paved the way for the election of Woodrow Wilson, the Democratic candidate. It was a devastating defeat for both Taft and Roosevelt, and a turning point in American politics.
Absolutely. It marked the end of an era and ushered in a new phase of progressive reform under Wilson. But amidst all this political drama, there's another side to Taft that we often overlook.
Yes. Let's not forget that he was also a human being, with his own personal struggles, his own passions and hobbies. I read that he was a huge baseball fan, and the first president that threw out the first pitch at a baseball game.
That's right. He loved baseball. And he was also an avid golfer. In fact, his love of golf actually drew criticism at the time. People thought it was an elitist sport, out of touch with the average American. But Taft's enthusiasm for the game actually helped popularize it in the United States.
So even seemingly trivial details like a president's hobbies can have a ripple effect on culture and society. It's a reminder that these historical figures were real people with passions and quirks just like us.
Exactly. And it's important to remember that amidst all the political battles and policy debates, Taft was also dealing with personal challenges, particularly his lifelong struggle with his weight.
You know, it's interesting to consider how his weight might have impacted his public image and his self-perception. Do you think it played a role in how he was perceived by the public and the press?
It's hard to say for sure, but it's certainly possible. At the time, obesity wasn't as understood as it is today, and there was a lot of stigma associated with it. Some speculate that Taft's eating habits were a coping mechanism for the stress and disappointments of his presidency. But it's important to approach these issues with sensitivity and avoid making judgments about his personal struggles.
Absolutely. It's a reminder that even those in positions of power are not immune to the challenges and vulnerabilities that we all face. But despite those challenges, Taft never gave up on public service. And in a twist of fate, after the disappointment of his presidency, he achieved his lifelong dream.
That's right. In 1921, President Harding appointed Taft as Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. It was a fitting capstone to a long and tumultuous career.
It really is. It's almost like a redemption arc, wouldn't you say? After all the political turmoil and the disappointment of his presidency, he finally found his true calling in the highest court of the land.
Yeah, it really is remarkable when you think about it. Taft's journey took him from a reluctant colonial administrator in the Philippines to a president grappling with complex domestic and foreign policy issues to ultimately becoming Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. It's not the trajectory you might expect, but it speaks to his resilience and adaptability.
And it highlights a key theme that emerges from all these sources. There's always more to the story than meets the eye. We often reduce historical figures to simple narratives, focusing on their most well-known accomplishments or failures. But Taft's story reminds us that these were complex individuals who navigated a world that was just as messy and unpredictable as our own.
Absolutely. And it's in those messy details, those unexpected twists and turns, that we often find the most compelling insights. I mean, who would have guessed that the guy who got stuck in the bathtub would go on to have such profound impact on the Supreme Court? Yeah. It's almost poetic, isn't it? After all the political turmoil and the disappointment of his presidency, Taft found peace and fulfillment in a role that truly suited his temperament and intellect. As Chief Justice, he was no longer constrained by the pressures of partisan politics or the need to please the public. He could focus on what he loved most, the law, and use his knowledge and experience to shape legal precedent for generations to come.
And he served as Chief Justice for 9 years, longer than his presidency. What stands out to you about his tenure on the court?
Well, a few things. First, Taft was a strong advocate for judicial efficiency. He streamlined the court's procedures, reduced his backlog of cases, and pushed for the construction of a dedicated building for the Supreme Court, which had previously been housed in the Capitol building. This might seem mundane, but it reflects his belief in the importance of a well-functioning judiciary and his commitment to making the court a more respected and influential institution.
So he wasn't just a brilliant legal mind, but also a savvy administrator. He recognized that the court needed to be more than just a place where cases were decided. It needed to be seen as a vital and independent branch of government.
Precisely. And second, Taft's time on the court coincided with a period of significant social and economic change in America. The country was grappling with issues like industrialization, urbanization, and the rise of big business. Taft's legal opinions on these matters reflected his conservative leanings, emphasizing the importance of property rights, limited government regulation, and a strict interpretation of the Constitution.
But wasn't he also known for his commitment to upholding individual liberties? Didn't he author some important opinions that expanded the rights of workers and minorities?
He did. It's important to remember that even though Taft was generally considered a conservative, he was also a product of his time. He believed in the rule of law and recognized the need to adapt legal principles to changing social conditions. For example, he wrote the majority opinion in a case that upheld the right of labor unions to organize and bargain collectively, and in another case, he wrote an opinion that struck down a state law that prohibited interracial marriage.
So he wasn't simply a rigid ideologue. He was willing to evolve his thinking and to apply legal principles in a way that reflected the complexities of the real world. It sounds like his time on the court was a period of both personal and professional fulfillment.
I think that's a fair assessment. After the turmoil of his presidency, Taft found a sense of purpose and satisfaction in serving as Chief Justice. He was respected by his colleagues, admired for his legal acumen, and able to leave a lasting legacy on the institution he had always revered.
It's a reminder that success can take many forms. It's not always about winning elections or achieving widespread popularity. Sometimes it's about pursuing your passions, making a difference in the world, and leaving a legacy that extends far beyond your lifetime.
And for Taft, that legacy is deeply intertwined with his experience in the Philippines. It's the thread that connects his early career to his presidency and to his ultimate fulfillment as Chief Justice. It highlights the interconnectedness of history, how seemingly disparate events can have a profound impact on the course of a person's life and on the nation as a whole.
It's also a reminder that we should never underestimate the power of experience, the lessons we learn from our successes and our failures, and the ways in which those lessons shape who we become.
And Taft's story, with all its unexpected twists and turns, is a testament to that. He faced immense challenges, both personal and political. But he never gave up on his dreams. He remained committed to public service, to the law, and to his vision of a better America.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into the life of William Howard Taft, what key takeaway should we leave with our listeners?
I think the most important takeaway is this. Don't be afraid to challenge your assumptions. Look beyond the simple narratives and dig deeper into the complexities of history. You might be surprised by what you discover.
Well said. William Howard Taft was far more than just the guy who got stuck in the bathtub. He was a brilliant legal mind, a dedicated public servant, and a complex individual who played a pivotal role in shaping American history. And his story reminds us that even the most overlooked figures can have a lasting impact on the world. So keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep uncovering the hidden depths of history. You never know what you might find.